In biblical studies, the origins of Yahweh have two primary schools of thought. The first is as the Hebrew Bible, or the Old Testament, describes, with some caveats. Yahweh was among the deities of the Canaanite pantheon, who, as the Israelites took on a distinctive identity, separate from their Canaanite brethren, eventually adopted Yahweh as their chief god. Another school asserts that Yahweh has no connection whatsoever to the Canaanite pantheon, and that Yahweh's origins lay south of the Levant and in the Arabian Peninsula, among the nomadic warrior tribes of the Kenites and Midianites. This is called the Kenite-Midianite Hypothesis. Friedrich Wilhelm Galeni, a German Lutheran theologian and Bible scholar of the 19th century, first proposed the hypothesis by maintaining that Yahweh's origins lay outside the lands of Canaan. Subsequent generations of biblical scholars, with new archaeological and textual evidence open to them, began to flesh out the idea. By the mid-20th century, the Kenite-Midianite hypothesis became widely accepted in German higher criticism, as well as among various American and English biblical scholars. The basic idea runs through a reading of the Old Testament narrative, a recomposition of the Yahwist narrative, understanding that the Yahweh who is appearing in Genesis 2 and 3 is actually later than the Yahweh that we discover in the Exodus narrative, and other Levantine and Egyptian archaeological and linguistic arguments. In the biblical narrative, the Old Testament God is generally referred to as El or Yahweh, which gives us the textual traditions of the Elohist, writings that use the term El or Elohim and its many variations, and the Yahwist source material, writings that use the term Yahweh and its various named variations. In the Torah, while Yahweh is one of the names encountered in Genesis as mentioned, in the Israelite narrative history, the introduction of Yahweh isn't until Exodus, when Moses flees to the Midianites, having killed an Egyptian, and takes refuge among them. Through the meeting with Jethro, the burning bush, and Joshua's declaration of the great works of God, of Yahweh, the hypothesis asserts that these events represent the earliest inclusion of Yahweh to the Israelites. The Genesis 2 through 3 narrative, dealing with Eden, Adam and Eve, then are actually part of a nomadic Midianite mythology, and we'll talk about that in a bit. Rather than see Jethro converted to Yahweh, the Kenite-Midianite hypothesis asserts that Jethro was always a patron of the Midianite deity, and he reaffirms his fidelity to Yahweh in this episode in Exodus. Moses then is introduced to Yahweh through his seeking refuge with the Midianites, becomes converted to Yahweh among the Midianites, and returns to the enslaved Israelites in Egypt as a representative of Yahweh. Furthermore, in the biblical narrative that we have, Yahweh declares that the God known to the Israelite patriarchs was El Shaddai. This, for the proponents of the Kenite-Midianite hypothesis, not to mention the Elohist source material is what one finds in the Genesis patriarchal narratives, is also a dead giveaway. Before the burning bush and Moses among the Midianites, God's name was known to the Israelites and the patriarchs as El, a Canaanite deity. But now, with Moses among the Midianites, a new God appears, and his name is revealed, and it is Yahweh. Additional biblical texts are used to reaffirm this narrative. Deuteronomy 33:2, Judges 5:4, Habakkuk 3:3 and 3:7, and Isaiah 63:1 all mention the origins of Yahweh as coming south of the Levant. Reading back into Genesis, the Yahweh source, is actually therefore a textual redaction among the Josian editors, who sought to include an origin story. The Adam-Eve Eden narrative is, then, a Midianite origin myth of how they became and are still wandering nomads. Remember, at the end of the Eden story, Adam and Eve are expelled to wander the earth, just as the Midianites are nomadic wanderers who cannot enter a permanent garden oasis. We will look in fuller detail about how to understand the Eden narrative in Genesis 2 and 3 from the perspective of the Kenite-Midianite Hypothesis in another lecture. To summarize the Kenite-Midianite Hypothesis, then, the named textual variants of God in the Old Testament represent different origins from different people groups who came to form the eventual Israelite Judahite tribes that give us the Hebrew Bible or the Old Testament. Because we have two different named traditions, the Elohist and the Yahwist, these represent different deity traditions among the biblical authors and editors and people groups that came together to form the basis and provide the stories for the Old Testament. The Kenite-Midianite hypothesis argues that Yahweh was a distinct deity, separate from the Canaanite pantheon, as evidenced by the Yahweh source in Exodus, seen through the revelation of God's name to Moses after he flees the Midianites. This represents, in the Israelite historical narrative, the first contact with Yahwism, and Moses becomes the prophetic disciple of Yahweh, thus incorporating the Midianite deity into the Israelite narrative tradition. Again, as Moses encounters Yahweh, Yahweh tells him that prior to this revelation, this theophany, the patriarchs, the fathers of Moses and the Israelites, knew him as El Shaddai, a different textual variant. That Yahweh is a deity of Midianite origins also seems to be verified by other Old Testament writings, which acknowledge Yahweh as having come from the lands south of the Levant, south of the Promised Land, among the area where the Midianites and Kenites were. The inclusion of the Kenites as part of the conquest force in Joshua also brings Yahweh as a war god into the picture. For archaeological and linguistic reasons affirmed both within the biblical text and extra-biblical source material, Yahweh was originally a god who was a deity among the Kenites and Midianites south of the Levant that got incorporated into the Israelite memory and oral traditions, then, through being a war god important to the war chiefs who united Israel, emerged as the chief deity of Israel, Judah. And in our next lecture, looking at the origins and triumph of Yahweh, we will turn to the notion of Yahweh as a war god.